Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books in philosophy, one of which is The Nature of Aesthetics. Joining me is my co-host, Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale and is a venture capitalist on the West Coast. Good to see you, Rick.
Good to see you.
Today our subject matter is the incidents in Germany on New Year's Eve on December 31st, 2015, extending into January 1st. The purpose of the philosophical angle is to analyze the nature and essence of concepts being used in current media. And this week, Cologne presents a certain aspect that we want to investigate. And so let's bring up a little diagram of the Cologne matter and see where it takes us. Whoop, that's an article from the Wall Street Journal. Okay, so first, let's discuss the facts as we know them, as the media has has given them to us. First, witnesses and victims say the criminal aggressors were of Middle Eastern extraction. Therefore, probably they were of Muslim origin, followers of Islam. Further, government operatives delayed giving news on this criminal riot for several days. So why was that? Why the delay? And furthermore, why the riots in the first place? Because over 100 men contributed to this, and not only in Cologne, but I heard that there were incidents in other cities as well. And so it must have been planned and coordinated. So with these in mind, let's explore first why the delay. Well, the delay is probably because politicians apologize for Muslims in general. Here in the American media, we've seen many examples of that. But why is it that politicians apologize for Muslims and for Islam and for the violent incidences that it produces? Well, it's because it is politically correct. All actions and the politically and PC can be defined as all actions and cultural contents of society to be the same in value, because all are and must be equal. That is, all values must be equal for all the issues that come before society. Therefore, a Muslim and Islam as a religion is the same as Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, or any other religion. But now society is realizing that Muslims are more violent and that Islam does incite violence. There is no immediate equivalent in Christianity or Judaism or other religions. Therefore, they must delay to seek a sign that they are equal. In other words, they're delaying the news, seeking and hoping that there'll be some explanation come forth that will otherwise be able to explain the anomaly that's coming before them, because they believe that Muslims and Islam are equivalent to any other religion. Because if it's not, it just doesn't compute in their thought processes. So let's go up, and some of the other questions that we were considering are: why the riots? Well, the riots are based in the Sunnah. And the Sunnah is comprised of the Quran, which is the uh, which is what was intimated by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, and thus it's the word of God, the word of Allah. And the Hadith are the sayings and traditions of Muhammad during his life. These are not necessarily given to him by the angel Gabriel, so it's not really the direct word from God. And these comprise the basis from which Muslim law is generated, and that is, and together it's all called the Sunnah. Muslim law is, of course, Sharia, which is a term well used in the media. So, from the aspects of so some of the aspects of the Sunnah are that if you go outside of Islam, really anything goes. Muslims have no particular ethic or obligations or need to respect anything but those that are believers, and to the non-believers they have no particular obligation. And thus, according to women, to non-believers, non-believing women, they can be looked upon as sex objects. They can be denigrated, and even they can be considered sex slaves. And so you're probably wondering, how could I say such a thing, that Islam can even today can believe that women can be sex slaves? Well, it's in the Quran, and in fact, why don't we just go to the Quran and let's go to page 2. Oops. Let's go to page 2 of this. So women are the premise here is that women are inferior. So let's take an example from the Quran. Surah 33, verse 33, and abide quietly in your homes. This means that women are confined to their homes except when they have permission to go out. In the Hadith, 1039. Oh, and by the way, there are probably about 8,000 hadiths, individual sayings of Muhammad, somewhere around there. So Aisha said to Muhammad, "You have made us equal to the dogs and the asses." And these words are from, and Aisha was the favorite wife of Muhammad, and she was just kind of complaining about it, about their role. From the Pickthall, Muhammad Pickthall was a famous translator of the Quran, and in verse 30, Surah 33, verse 50, "O Prophet, lo, we have made lawful unto thee thy wives, unto whom thou hast paid their dowries, and those whom thy right hand possesseth, of those whom Allah hath given thee as spoils of war." In other words, these women are possessions of the Prophet, and thus this tradition is passed down to those who fight for Islam. They may possess women other than their wives, and those and thus sex slaves even today in certain Muslim societies exist. The right to have them. Okay, so let's go to Rick and see what he thinks of these of what happened in Cologne, and whether it has any significance in the really the struggle between Western culture and Middle Eastern culture. Rick?
Based on what I've read, in the press. Angela Merkel, in particular, has reacted to these events with the directive, really, to the police that wrongdoers be punished to the full extent of the law. He obviously thinks that if laws are applied, German laws in this case, this behavior will be controlled going forward. The implication of your argument is that that is extremely unlikely. That this is part and parcel of an ethic that these Muslim men grew up with. They're not about to abandon it overnight, and therefore to expect this behavior not to be repeated is essentially foolish. Let me present a very simple proposition. A government that cannot, to the best of its ability, guarantee public safety has little, if any, legitimacy. And that's particularly true in modern economies. I'll present another proposition, and that is voters and taxpayers who have no confidence in the ability of a government to guarantee their public safety have every right to remove those government officials who fail in that very basic function. I say that because I think the political implications of these events, and I would be very surprised if they're not replicated elsewhere as time goes on, where the refugees land. Obviously, Germany is attracted the most, but other countries such as Hungary and Sweden have also taken in quite a few as a percentage of their population. I think you can expect to see that the political backlash is going to be severe, and it will grow over time as this festers and more and similar events reoccur. So I think Angela Merkel and other politicians in Europe have put themselves at extreme risk, and voters very legitimately have a right to throw them out of office.
And so when you say extreme risk, you mean the risk to their political careers?
Yes.
And but I don't see Europe changing much. So if another party comes in, do you think that will change the politics of European immigration much?
Not over the short term, but dealing with this sort of public disturbance is one thing. If there are more terrorist attacks, I think you could see European public opinion change very dramatically, very quickly. And I wouldn't be surprised if those sorts of events were to occur, that you would see a significant number of deportations.
Yeah, you mentioned that part of my thesis here, opening comments, that these men will not change, and that's true because it's if they were to change and find themselves outside of Islam, they would be considered an apostate, which is by some Islamic societies subject to the death penalty. So, and that's also has origins in the Quran and in the Hadith, probably more strongly in the Hadith. So it's not possible for these men to change because they were coming from they are Islamic followers. So let's take a couple of these articles from the Wall Street Journal since and let's explore them. From the January 11th edition, report on Cologne's New Year's assault says overwhelmed police didn't seek backup. The number of complaints alleging theft, bodily assault, and sexual offenses in Cologne on New Year's Eve has now risen to more than 120. Let's see here. Let's go down here. The Cologne police said they had received 553 complaints of New Year's Eve incidents, 45% of them including sexual violations. Yet this was not reported immediately. The federal police, meanwhile, said that they were investigating the 32 aspects that they identified last week. 22 of them were asylum seekers. So a significant portion were coming from the Syrian refugee pool, which Angela Merkel has allowed into the country, much to the chagrin of many of the German culture. So, do you have any comment on why it one that the police did let this information out slowly, and what if it is found that, or it does seem that all these asylum seekers are fomenting these small incidents of terror, although no assassinations were committed. It is horrific in itself. These sexual advances by on the women. What do you think, Rick?
Well, I think the default position of many, if not most, liberals is that whenever something awful happens, somehow it can be traced back to the dominant white population. Somehow they're at fault. Either they mistreated these people in some way, and this is a just reward or an understandable reaction, as Kerry might say, John Kerry. But I think in order to, it was obviously a cover-up, all right? And because the facts were so overwhelming, there was probably a discussion going on in the background about what would happen if we presented the facts as they are to the public. Aren't we risking some sort of neo-Nazi retaliation and putting the Muslims potentially at risk, under the assumption that the prevailing white population are a bunch of crazies who have to be controlled, right? Some thinking along those lines. This is not dissimilar, by the way, to how our own head of the Justice Department, the Attorney General, reacted after the San Bernardino killings, right? Her first instinct was to inveigh against Islamophobia, that is the issue at hand. That was her initial reaction. I think a similar kind of dynamic was playing out in Germany, and it's exactly the kind of reaction that infuriates the normal white population, who increasingly dislike being viewed as a bunch of right-wing crazies and blamed for everything.
So what are the long-term consequences of this type of political behavior? Equating really not understanding that there is a problem with Islam, and especially with homegrown Islam right here in cultures from which they're foreign to. Is there any long-term consequences?
Well, I think we're already seeing in the United States and in parts of Europe anyway that the consensus politics are breaking down. The different segments of the population are rallying around the extremes. If you consider what happened in the recent French election, the unthinkable actually occurred. That is to say, the Socialist Party withdrew its candidates from most, if not all, of the regional elections, so that the conservatives could prevail against Marie Le Pen's National Front. In other words, they pulled a trick in order to prevent the far right under Marie Le Pen from winning. Well, what that suggests is that the consensus, left liberal, right liberal, existing French political class has now been moved over to the left vis-a-vis this surging right-wing party called the National Front. And this has all happened in the space of a few years. And you're seeing the same thing play out in the United States with Bernie Sanders tied virtually with Hillary Clinton on the left, and Donald Trump still the leading contender on the right.
Let's go to let's go to some final comments in these articles. And just to confirm the some more what we've been talking about. Immediately after the mayor's pronouncements, the commander of the police department's homicide unit calmly took the microphone. Captain James Clark reported that the shooter, later identified as 30-year-old Edward Archer, we're speaking of this killing of the cop here in recently by not killing, wounding, had repeatedly said he followed Allah, and that he pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. That is the reason I did what I did. And previously, they had the mayor said, in no way, shape, or form does anyone in this room believe that Islam is the teaching of Islam. So you can see that these politicians do not want to confront this problem. And the article, one of the conclusions is that this has led to Donald Trump's success in attracting voters. What do you think? Is that a fair conclusion that this article draws?
Yeah, I think it's very eloquently put, as usual, from Dorothy Rabinowitz. She's a fine writer.
Right. And later on, in one article by Brett Stevens, we go right down here to the bottom, and he concludes, let's open our doors wide to women, young children, and the elderly, and let's close it shut to the men. They have a mess to clean up in their own countries, and much to prove in the horrifying wake of Cologne. Good conclusion by Brett, and certainly I would think a little bit of not a normal conclusion that you would see in the Wall Street Journal.
No, certainly not. And deliberately provocative. But he brings up a very important point. We are taking in mainly male refugees, as is Europe, who are fleeing a country that arguably they should be trying to save. Certainly not a courageous act. And of course, what he's suggesting is not practical. You're not going to separate men from their families.
Well, they self-separated. I mean, they really migrated by themselves and leaving. They were all young men of military age, and no women and children were accompanied them. So they almost it looks like they had no problem with it.
Yeah, it's appalling. I mean, in that sense, it's appalling. I was only making the point that if there's a family um, in amongst those groups of refugees, I don't think the United States would countenance separating the father from, the children and the wife. But you're right. The vast majority have been young men.
Okay. All right, Rick, I want to thank you very much. It's about all we have time for on this episode of the philosophical angle. We'll see you next week, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.